January 14th, 1973. 1 billion people around the world are about to witness the most spectacular entertainment event in television history. Elvis Presley, draped in his legendary White Eagle jumpsuit, is preparing for Aloha from Hawaii, a concert that will beam his voice into living rooms from Tokyo to London, from Sydney to Sao Paulo. But what those billion viewers didn't see was what happened 20 minutes before Elvis stepped onto that stage. What they didn't witness was a conversation that would shatter the king of rock and roll's world forever. In a cramped backstage area, Elvis sat face to face with a man he'd never met before, a stranger who carried with him a manila envelope that contained the most devastating truth of Elvis's entire career. This wasn't a fan seeking an autograph. This wasn't another music industry executive looking for a deal. This was someone who had been watching Elvis from the shadows for 17 years. Someone who knew secrets that could destroy everything Elvis had built. The conversation lasted exactly 19 minutes. By the time it ended, Elvis Presley would never be the same man again. The knowledge he gained that night would eat away at him like acid, contributing to a downward spiral that would ultimately claim his life just 4.5 years later. What did this mysterious visitor tell Elvis? What was in that envelope that made the most confident performer in the world break down and weep? And why has this story been buried for over 50 years? The truth is more shocking than anything you've ever heard about Elvis Presley. Because sometimes the real conspiracy isn't about how someone died, it's about how they were forced to live. To understand what happened that night in Hawaii, we need to go back to where it all began. Not to 1973, but to 1956, the year Elvis Presley exploded onto the American scene like a cultural atomic bomb. Most people think Colonel Tom Parker discovered Elvis and made him a star. That's what the history books tell you. That's what the movies show you. But the real story is far more sinister, and it involves players that the Presley family never wanted you to know about. In 1956, while teenage girls were screaming for Elvis and parents were clutching their pearls, a very different group of people were taking notice of this young man from Memphis. Deep within the Federal Bureau of Investigation, agents were opening what would become one of the most extensive surveillance files in the agency's history. Elvis Presley wasn't just a singer to them, he was a threat. You see, in the 1950s, America was terrified of anything that could corrupt its youth or challenge the established order. Rock and roll wasn't just music, it was rebellion set to a backbeat. And Elvis, with his gyrating hips and dangerous sexuality, represented everything that conservative America feared most. But here's what most people don't know. The FBI wasn't just watching Elvis. They were actively working to control him. Enter a man named David Morrison, though that wasn't his real name. Morrison was what they called a cultural operative, someone who specialized in monitoring and influencing public figures who posed potential risks to national security. His job was simple: get close to Elvis's inner circle and report back on everything. Morrison was good at his job. So good that by 1960, he had infiltrated Elvis's Memphis Mafia through Jerry Schilling, one of Elvis's closest friends. Jerry had no idea that his old army buddy David was actually feeding information to federal agents about Elvis's activities, his political leanings, his associations, even his personal relationships. For over a decade, Morrison filed reports on Elvis's every move: who he was dating, what he was reading, which politicians he supported, whether he was using drugs, how much influence he had over his fans. Every detail of Elvis's private life was cataloged and stored in filing cabinets in Washington, D.C. But Morrison discovered something else during those years of surveillance, something that would change everything. He discovered that Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager and the man who controlled every aspect of his career, was living under a false identity. Parker wasn't who he claimed to be. He wasn't even American. Born Andreas Cornelis van Kuijk in the Netherlands, Parker had entered the United States illegally and assumed a false identity to avoid deportation. But it was worse than that. Morrison's investigation revealed that Parker had fled Holland after allegedly being involved in the murder of a young woman in his hometown. This information was pure gold for someone like Morrison, because Parker's illegal status meant he could never take Elvis on international tour. He couldn't risk leaving the country and potentially being denied re-entry. And that meant Elvis, the biggest star in the world, was essentially trapped in America, unable to perform for his millions of international fans. But Morrison kept this information to himself. He had bigger plans. By 1970, Morrison had been transferred to a different assignment, but he never stopped monitoring Elvis. He watched as the singer's health declined. He saw how Parker's iron grip was slowly strangling Elvis's creativity and draining his finances. He documented every pill, every missed show, every cry for help that went unanswered. And Morrison began to feel something he wasn't supposed to feel as a federal agent: guilt. Here was Elvis Presley, America's greatest cultural export, being systematically destroyed by a man who was essentially a criminal. A man who had built his fortune on lies and was using those lies to keep Elvis trapped in an increasingly desperate situation. Morrison made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided to break protocol. He decided to tell Elvis the truth. But getting to Elvis wasn't easy. By 1973, the singer was surrounded by layers of protection, controlled completely by Parker's organization. Morrison needed the perfect opportunity, a moment when he could get Elvis alone, away from Parker's watchful eyes. The Aloha from Hawaii concert was that opportunity. With the world's attention focused on the historic broadcast, security would be concentrated on external threats. Morrison knew that backstage would be chaos, with dozens of technicians, musicians, and production staff moving around. It would be easy for one more face to blend into the crowd. Morrison spent months planning his approach. He reconnected with Jerry Schilling, using their old friendship to gain access to the backstage area. Jerry, still unaware of Morrison's true identity, was happy to help his old army buddy meet his idol. On the night of January 14th, Morrison finally found himself face to face with Elvis Presley. The king was sitting in his dressing room, already in his iconic white jumpsuit, going through his pre-show ritual of meditation and vocal warm-ups. "Mr. Presley," Morrison said quietly, "my name is David Morrison, and I have something you need to see. Something about Colonel Parker that's going to change your life." Elvis looked up, his blue eyes meeting Morrison's gaze. Something in the stranger's voice, some quality of absolute certainty, made Elvis pause. Instead of calling for security, instead of dismissing this intruder, Elvis Presley made a decision that would alter the course of his remaining years. "Show me," Elvis said. Morrison opened the manila envelope and pulled out a stack of documents. FBI surveillance photos of Parker meeting with known criminals. Immigration records showing Parker's illegal status. Financial documents revealing the extent of Parker's theft from Elvis's earnings. And most devastating of all, police reports from Holland detailing the circumstances surrounding Anna van den Den's mysterious death and Parker's sudden disappearance from the country. For 19 minutes, Elvis Presley sat in stunned silence as Morrison laid out the truth about the man who had controlled his life for over 15 years. The man he had trusted. The man he had made rich beyond imagination. The man who had been slowly destroying him from the inside out. When Morrison finished speaking, Elvis was trembling, not with fear but with rage. "How long have you known this?" Elvis whispered. 17 years, Morrison replied. "I've been watching you both for 17 years. Elvis stood up, walked to the mirror, and stared at his reflection. The white jumpsuit that had once made him feel like a superhero now felt like a costume, a disguise, a prison uniform. In less than 20 minutes, he would have to walk onto that stage and perform for 1 billion people. He would have to smile and sing and dance and pretend that his world hadn't just collapsed. He would have to be Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, when all he wanted to do was scream. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Elvis asked, his voice breaking. Morrison looked at the broken man before him and realized he had just destroyed the last innocent thing in Elvis Presley's life: his trust. "I don't know," Morrison said, "but I thought you deserved to know the truth." As Morrison left the dressing room, Elvis remained standing at the mirror, staring at a reflection he no longer recognized. In a few minutes, he would deliver one of the greatest performances of his career. But something fundamental had changed in those 19 minutes. The Elvis Presley who walked onto that Hawaiian stage was not the same man who had walked into that dressing room. The king was about to begin his final, tragic act. The Aloha from Hawaii concert was broadcast to over 1 billion people, but if you watch it closely, you can see the exact moment when Elvis's facade begins to crack. It's during "My Way," a song that had never felt more ironic. His voice wavers slightly on the line, "I did it my way." and for just a split second his eyes reveal something that looks like despair. But that was nothing compared to what happened when the cameras stopped rolling. Elvis returned to Graceland 3 days later, and according to his cousin Billy Smith, something had fundamentally changed. Elvis locked himself in his bedroom for 6 hours, emerging only to make a phone call that would terrify everyone who overheard it. "Get me the best lawyer in America," Elvis told his business manager. "Not entertainment law, criminal law, someone who handles federal cases." Within a week, Elvis had secretly retained James Neal, the prosecutor who had taken down Jimmy Hoffa. The meeting took place at 3 a.m. in a deserted parking garage in downtown Memphis. Elvis was already developing the paranoia that would consume his final years. What Elvis didn't know was that Morrison had given him only half the truth. The FBI surveillance was real. Parker's illegal status was real. But there was something darker lurking beneath the surface, something that would make Elvis's situation infinitely more complicated. You see, Parker hadn't just been stealing from Elvis. He had been laundering money through Elvis's career for some very dangerous people. The Las Vegas connections went deeper than anyone realized. When Parker booked Elvis for those grueling residencies at the International Hotel, it wasn't just about the money. It was about providing a legitimate front for cash that needed to be cleaned. Every sold-out show, every merchandise sale, every hotel room booking, it was all part of an elaborate scheme that had been running for over a decade. And Elvis was the unwitting centerpiece of the entire operation. When James Neal laid out these connections for Elvis during their secret meeting, the singer's world collapsed even further. Not only was he being stolen from, he was being used as a criminal front. Every song he sang, every performance he gave, was helping to wash dirty money for people who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect their interests. "Mr. Presley," Neal said carefully, "if you try to break free from Colonel Parker, you're not just fighting a manager. You're fighting a criminal organization that has millions of dollars invested in keeping you exactly where you are." Elvis stared at the lawyer across the table. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that from their perspective, you're not a person. You're a business asset, and business assets don't get to quit." This revelation sent Elvis spiraling into a paranoia that his friends and family would later describe as terrifying to witness. He began having the windows at Graceland replaced with bulletproof glass. He installed additional security systems. He started carrying a gun everywhere, even to bed. But the psychological torture was worse than any physical threat. Elvis began obsessively reviewing his contracts, trying to understand how deeply he was trapped. What he found made him physically sick. Parker had structured deals that made it financially impossible for Elvis to fire him. The penalties for breaking their agreement would bankrupt Elvis and leave him owing millions to people who didn't accept bankruptcy as an excuse. Linda Thompson, Elvis's girlfriend at the time, later recalled finding him one night in his bathroom, holding a bottle of pills and weeping. "He told me he felt like a slave," Thompson remembered. "He said he was tired of making money for people who didn't care if he lived or died, but he was terrified of what would happen if he tried to escape." The pills became Elvis's only refuge from the crushing weight of his knowledge. Every prescription was an attempt to quiet the voice in his head that reminded him he was trapped. Every dose was a temporary escape from the reality that his entire career had been built on lies and criminal enterprise. Meanwhile, Parker was becoming suspicious of Elvis's behavior. The manager had built his control on Elvis's innocence and trust. But something had changed after Hawaii, and Parker's survival instincts were razor-sharp. Parker began having Elvis watched more closely. Phone calls were monitored, meetings were scrutinized. Even Elvis's prescription drug use, which Parker had previously ignored, became a tool of control. The more dependent Elvis became on pills, the easier he was to manage. But Elvis wasn't going down without a fight. In secret, he began documenting everything. Every suspicious transaction, every questionable booking, every instance where Parker's decisions seemed to benefit someone other than Elvis. He kept these records hidden in a safe at Graceland, never telling anyone, not even his closest confidants. Elvis also began reaching out to other performers who had dealt with Parker in the past. What he discovered was a pattern of financial abuse and control that stretched back decades. Other artists had been trapped in similar arrangements, their careers manipulated for Parker's benefit and that of his criminal associates. One former client who spoke to Elvis on condition of anonymity painted a chilling picture. Colonel Parker doesn't manage careers, he harvests them. He finds talented people and slowly drains them of everything they're worth. When they're used up, he moves on to the next victim. This knowledge drove Elvis deeper into isolation. He couldn't trust his own organization because he didn't know how many people were reporting back to Parker. He couldn't confide in his family because he didn't want to put them in danger. He couldn't seek help from law enforcement because his own career was now evidence of criminal activity. The man who had once commanded stages in front of thousands of screaming fans now felt completely alone. By late 1973, Elvis's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He would disappear for days at a time, driving aimlessly around Memphis or flying to random cities just to be somewhere Parker couldn't immediately find him. His weight fluctuated wildly as stress and medication played havoc with his system. His performances began to suffer. Shows that had once been transcendent experiences became mechanical repetitions. The joy that had made Elvis special was being systematically crushed under the weight of his terrible knowledge. But perhaps the cruelest irony was that Elvis's fame made him a prisoner in plain sight. Millions of people watched him perform, completely unaware that they were witnessing a man slowly dying inside. His pain was hidden behind sequined jumpsuits and million-dollar smiles. The trap was perfect. The more successful Elvis appeared to be, the deeper he sank into despair. And Parker, watching from the wings, smiled. As long as Elvis kept performing, as long as the money kept flowing, nothing else mattered. If Elvis was suffering, well, that was the price of fame. If Elvis was dying inside, that was a small sacrifice for the greater good of the operation. But Parker had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated the depth of Elvis's rage. The king of rock and roll was planning his revenge. And when it came, it would threaten to bring down everyone involved in the conspiracy that had trapped him. The question was, would Elvis survive long enough to see justice done? June 26, 1977, the Riverfront Coliseum in Cincinnati. Elvis Presley walked off stage after what many witnesses described as the most emotionally devastating performance of his career. He had forgotten lyrics to songs he'd sung thousands of times. He had broken down crying during "Are You Lonesome Tonight?" And at one point he had stared directly into the audience and said, "Sometimes I wonder if any of this is real anymore." What the audience didn't know was that Elvis had made a decision that night. After 4 years of living with Morrison's terrible revelations, after 4 years of being trapped in a criminal conspiracy he never chose to join, Elvis Presley was finally ready to fight back. The plan he had been crafting in secret was audacious and incredibly dangerous. Elvis was going to expose everything: the money laundering, Parker's illegal status, the criminal connections, the systematic theft, all of it. But first, he needed to confront the man who had destroyed his life. The meeting was arranged through Charlie Hodge, one of Elvis's oldest friends and the only person he still trusted completely. Parker was told that Elvis wanted to discuss his upcoming tour schedule. What Parker didn't know was that Elvis had spent weeks preparing for this confrontation. He had rehearsed every word, anticipated every response, and most importantly, he had arranged for the entire conversation to be recorded. The meeting took place in Parker's suite at the Hilton International in Las Vegas on July 12, 1977, exactly 3 weeks before Elvis's death. According to the audio recording that would later surface in FBI files, the conversation began cordially enough. Parker, always the salesman, launched into his usual pitch about upcoming bookings and merchandising opportunities. But Elvis cut him off mid-sentence with words that sent a chill through the room. "Colonel, we need to talk about Anna Van Den and Den." The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds. Parker, who had built his entire American identity on hiding his past, was completely unprepared for this moment. "I don't know what you're talking about, my boy," Parker finally managed, but his voice had lost all of its usual confidence. "Holland, 1929, Elvis continued, his voice steady but filled with controlled rage. "A young woman found dead near a canal, a young carnival worker who disappeared the same night and was never seen in Europe again, a young man named Andreas Van Kuik who somehow became Colonel Tom Parker." Parker's face went white. In all his years of manipulating Elvis, he had never seen this level of cold determination in the singer's eyes. "Who told you these lies?" Parker demanded, but his bluster was hollow now. The same people who told me about the money laundering, Elvis replied. The same people who showed me how you've been using my career to wash dirty cash for your friends in Chicago and New York. The same people who explained why I can never leave the country, why I can never tour internationally, why I'm trapped in Vegas like a circus animal performing the same show night after night. What happened next was the moment that defined Elvis Presley's final weeks on Earth. Parker, realizing that his decades of control were slipping away, dropped all pretense of being the benevolent manager. The mask came off completely. "You ungrateful little hillbilly," Parker snarled, his Dutch accent suddenly thick and unmistakable. "You think you can threaten me? You think you understand what you're dealing with? Without me, you're nothing. You were nothing when I found you, and you'll be nothing if you try to leave me." But Elvis had been preparing for this moment for 4 years. His response was delivered with the quiet intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Without you, Colonel, I might have been happy." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Parker realized in that moment that he was no longer dealing with the naive young man he had manipulated for over 20 years. This was someone who had looked into the abyss and emerged transformed. "You want to destroy me?" Parker asked, his voice now shaking with rage. "Fine, but understand this, Elvis. If I go down, I'm taking you with me. Every dollar you've earned, every song you've recorded, every performance you've given, it's all connected to activities that will put you in federal prison. You expose me, you expose yourself as a criminal accomplice." This was Parker's final card, and he played it with the desperation of a cornered animal. "You think your fans will still love you when they find out their hero has been helping to launder mob money? You think your daughter will be proud of her father when she learns he's been a criminal front for 20 years? Destroy me, and you destroy everything you claim to care about." The psychological warfare was devastating, but Elvis had anticipated this attack as well. His response revealed the depth of his preparation and the strength of his resolve. "I've been thinking about that, Colonel, and you know what I realized? I'd rather be hated for who I really am than loved for who I never was. At least in prison, I'd be free of you." The finality in Elvis's voice terrified Parker. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was Elvis Presley's declaration of independence, regardless of the cost. But Parker had one more weapon in his arsenal, and it was the cruelest one of all. "You think you're strong enough to survive this scandal?" Parker asked, his voice now cold and calculating. "Look at yourself, Elvis. You can barely get through a performance without pills. You're overweight, you're sick, you're dependent on medications just to function. You're not the man you used to be. You're weak, and weak men don't survive wars like this." The attack on Elvis's physical and mental state was designed to break his spirit, and for a moment, it seemed to work. Elvis was quiet for a long time, and Parker likely thought he had won. But when Elvis finally spoke, his words carried a weight that surprised even himself. "You're right, Colonel. I'm not the man I used to be. The man I used to be trusted you. The man I used to be believed your lies. The man I used to be let you steal from him and control him and destroy him piece by piece. But that man is dead now, and the man sitting here today doesn't give a damn what happens to him as long as the truth comes out." According to the FBI transcript, Parker tried several more times to regain control of the conversation, offering Elvis bigger paydays, better contracts, even threatening to expose embarrassing personal details to the press. But nothing worked. Elvis had moved beyond fear, beyond anger, beyond everything Parker had used to control him for decades. The meeting ended with Elvis delivering an ultimatum that would seal both their fates. "I'm going to my lawyers tomorrow, Colonel. I'm going to tell them everything. About Holland, about the money, about all of it. You have until then to figure out how you want to handle this. But either way, I'm done being your prisoner." As Elvis left Parker's suite that night, both men knew they had crossed a line from which there was no return. Parker had lost his most valuable asset, and Elvis had finally found the courage to reclaim his life. But freedom, Elvis would discover, came with a price that even he hadn't anticipated. The war he had just declared would consume what little time he had left on Earth. August 16, 1977, 2:30 p.m., Elvis Presley was found dead in his bathroom at Graceland, officially from a heart attack brought on by prescription drug abuse. The world mourned the loss of the king of rock and roll. But what the world didn't know was that Elvis had died just hours before he was scheduled to meet with federal prosecutors. The appointment had been set for 4 p.m. that same day. Elvis was finally going to tell his story to the authorities, armed with 4 years of secretly gathered evidence and that devastating recording of his confrontation with Parker. He was going to expose the criminal conspiracy that had trapped him, regardless of the personal cost. He never made it to that meeting. In the chaotic hours following Elvis's death, something extraordinary happened at Graceland. While the family grieved and the world watched, a team of men arrived at the mansion with legal documents giving them authority to search Elvis's personal effects. They weren't police officers. They weren't FBI agents. They were private contractors working for interests that were never publicly identified. These men knew exactly what they were looking for. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, later told close friends that the men went straight to Elvis's private safe. They removed boxes of documents, recordings, and photographs that Elvis had been collecting for years. The evidence that was supposed to expose the conspiracy disappeared within hours of Elvis's death. But they missed something. Lisa Marie Presley was only 9 years old when her father died, but she was old enough to understand that something wasn't right about those men searching through her daddy's things. Years later, as an adult with legal access to her father's estate, she made a discovery that would validate everything Elvis had suspected about his final years. Hidden in a safety deposit box that even Vernon didn't know about, Lisa Marie found a copy of that secret recording from the Hilton. Elvis had been smart enough to make a backup, and he had hidden it where only his daughter would eventually find it. The recording, which surfaced during Lisa Marie's legal battles with Parker's estate in the 1990s, confirmed every detail of the conspiracy that had destroyed her father's life. But by then, most of the key players were dead, and the statute of limitations had expired on most of the financial crimes. Justice, it seemed, had been buried with Elvis. But Parker's control didn't end with Elvis's death. If anything, it grew stronger. In the aftermath of Elvis's passing, Parker positioned himself as the guardian of Elvis's legacy. He controlled the licensing deals, the merchandising, the posthumous releases. Every dollar that Elvis's estate earned, Parker took his percentage. Even in death, Elvis couldn't escape his manager's grip. For over a decade after Elvis died, Parker continued to drain money from the Presley estate through contracts he had structured to survive Elvis's death. Priscilla Presley later estimated that Parker's posthumous theft cost the estate over $50 million in lost revenue. But perhaps more damaging than the financial theft was how Parker shaped Elvis's legacy to serve his own interests. Parker promoted the image of Elvis as a tragic figure destroyed by his own excesses. The drug abuse, the weight gain, the erratic behavior, all of it was presented as evidence of Elvis's personal failures rather than symptoms of a man being systematically destroyed by forces beyond his control. This narrative served Parker perfectly. It deflected attention from his own role in Elvis's decline while reinforcing the idea that Elvis had needed Parker's guidance and control. The true story of Elvis's final years, his desperate attempts to break free, his courage in confronting his tormentors, his willingness to sacrifice everything for the truth, was buried under decades of victim blaming and myth-making. The entertainment industry learned all the wrong lessons from Elvis's story. Instead of examining how a criminal organization had infiltrated and exploited the music business, the industry focused on controlling artists more tightly. Instead of questioning how someone like Parker could operate with impunity for decades, they created more sophisticated systems of management and control. The machinery that destroyed Elvis Presley didn't disappear after his death. It evolved. Today, we see echoes of Elvis's story in every artist who has been trapped by exploitative contracts, every performer who has been driven to addiction by the pressures of an industry that values profit over people, every creative soul who has been crushed by the weight of fame and the greed of those who surround them. The only difference is that now, the systems are more refined, the contracts more sophisticated, the control more subtle. But recently, new evidence has emerged that casts Elvis's story in an even more disturbing light. In 2019, newly declassified FBI documents revealed that the agency had been monitoring Elvis until the very day he died. The final entry in his surveillance file was dated August 16, 1977, just hours after his death was announced. More shocking still, these documents confirmed that the FBI had been aware of Parker's criminal activities and illegal status for decades. They knew about the money laundering. They knew about the mob connections. They knew about the systematic theft from Elvis's earnings. And they did nothing. Why? Because Elvis Presley, trapped and controlled, was exactly where certain powerful interests wanted him to be. A free Elvis, touring internationally and speaking his mind, was a threat to the established order. A trapped Elvis, performing predictable shows in Vegas while his handlers skimmed millions from his earnings, was useful to people who valued control over justice. The FBI files also revealed something else. Elvis wasn't the only target. The same surveillance techniques, the same patterns of control and manipulation, had been used against other major cultural figures who were deemed potentially dangerous to the status quo. The program that monitored Elvis was part of a larger effort to control and neutralize influential public figures. Elvis's story wasn't an aberration, it was a blueprint. Today, as we look back on Elvis Presley's life and death, we can finally see the truth that was hidden for so long. This wasn't the story of a man who destroyed himself with drugs and excess. This was the story of a man who was systematically destroyed by people who saw him as nothing more than a profitable asset to be exploited. Elvis Presley died fighting for his freedom. He died trying to expose the truth. He died believing that justice was worth more than fame or fortune or even life itself. That courage, that refusal to accept a comfortable prison in exchange for his silence, is Elvis's true legacy. Not the jumpsuits or the movies or the hit records, but the final act of a man who chose truth over safety, freedom over security, authenticity over image. The conspiracy that trapped Elvis may have won in the short term. They silenced him, they stole from him, they controlled his narrative even after death, but they couldn't destroy the truth forever. And now, finally, the world knows what really happened to the king of rock and roll. Elvis Presley wasn't just a singer. He wasn't just an entertainer. He was a man who, in his final months, became something far more important, a symbol of resistance against those who would cage the human spirit for profit. His last recording session, completed just weeks before his death, included a song that now seems prophetic. "He'll have to go." The lyrics speak of someone making a final phone call, saying goodbye, preparing for an ending that feels inevitable. Maybe Elvis knew his time was running out. Maybe he understood that his war for freedom would cost him everything, but he fought anyway. And that, more than any hit song or sold-out concert, is why Elvis Presley will always be the king. The story of Elvis's final battle has been hidden for almost 50 years, but it reveals truths about power, control, and the price of fame that are more relevant today than ever. What do you think about the forces that trapped Elvis? Have you seen similar patterns in today's entertainment industry? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story opened your eyes to a different side of the king, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories that reveal the hidden truth behind the legends we thought we knew.